The wagon train crawled along the endless prairie like a string of tired ghosts, wheels groaning under the weight of what little hope people still carried west. The sun was merciless that morning, glaring off the dry earth until every breath felt like swallowing dust. And somewhere in the middle of that weary line walked Annie Doyle, her bonnet slipping crooked as she steadied herself beside the lead wagon. She'd joined the settlers out of necessity, not belonging, a teacher whose school had burned down and whose husband's grave lay 300 miles behind her. The others tolerated her kindness but mocked her clumsiness. She wasn't strong, she stuttered when nervous, and her shoes were 2 sizes too big. When the wagon hit a rut and jolted hard, she stumbled forward, her skirt catching on a splintered axle before the fabric tore clean through. She fell hard into the dirt, face scraping against gravel, bonnet flying off into the wind. The laughter started almost instantly, shrill, mean, and cutting. "Careful, schoolmarm," someone shouted. "The earth's already had enough of your preaching." Her cheeks burned as she tried to stand, clutching the torn fabric that barely covered her knees, dust mixing with tears. No one offered a hand. Not one. Even the driver looked away, muttering something about slowing the pace. That was when she saw him, Toka Gray Elk, standing beside his painted horse at the far edge of the trail, watching. He'd been riding with the scout detail since Kansas, a quiet Lakota man the settlers barely acknowledged, except to blame when something went wrong. But his eyes held no mockery. He stepped forward, slow and deliberate, his shadow falling across her as the laughter faded into uneasy silence. Without a word, he bent down and lifted her gently, one arm beneath her back, the other beneath her knees, as if she were made of something sacred. His touch was firm, but reverent, his face unreadable except for a flicker of sorrow that almost looked like apology. The wind shifted, lifting her torn skirt like a flag of shame. But he lowered his head, shielding her from every gaze. For the first time that day, no one laughed. "You're hurt," he said quietly, his voice deep, accented but careful. She tried to answer, but her throat closed. "I'm fine," she whispered finally. "You fell," he said, looking at the blood on her palm. "The earth does not like laughter when someone falls." She blinked at him, unsure if she'd heard right. He turned toward the wagon, still holding her as if the weight didn't matter. "You can walk?" he asked. Yes," she stammered, though her ankle throbbed with pain. He didn't put her down until she nodded again, steadying herself against the wagon wheel. Around them, no one spoke. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then he reached down, picked up her bonnet from the dust, brushed it off, and placed it gently back into her hands before walking away without another word. The silence he left behind felt heavier than the laughter had been. That night, as the wagons circled under the first stars, Annie sat alone, staring at the torn hem of her skirt and the dusty ribbon that had come loose when she fell. It lay coiled in her lap like something waiting to be tied back to meaning, and though she didn't understand why, she couldn't stop hearing his voice, soft, sure, and almost prayerful, saying that the earth did not like laughter when someone fell. Night spread across the plains like ink poured over parchment, swallowing the wagons one by one until only the small fires kept the darkness from taking everything. Annie Doyle sat apart from the others, her back against a wheel, her skirt mended as best as trembling fingers could manage. She had washed her hands in the creek, but the sting of the fall hadn't left her skin, or her mind. Each time she looked up, she caught people glancing her way before whispering, their laughter softer now but sharper somehow, like blades hidden in cloth. A little boy wandered by and asked, "Did it hurt, miss?" And before she could answer, his mother pulled him away, murmuring that it wasn't polite to talk to those who draw bad luck. Annie smiled faintly anyway. She had learned long ago that gentleness could exist even when uninvited. Across the firelight, Toka Gray Elk was tending to his horse, his movements calm and methodical, his breath a cloud in the cold. He hadn't looked at her once since helping her, but she could feel his presence like a quiet rhythm beneath the night. When the wind rose and the flames bent low, she saw the feather in his hair flicker gold for a heartbeat, and something in her chest ached, something that had nothing to do with shame. The wind carried laughter again from the main fire, rough men telling stories that weren't about courage, but cruelty dressed as humor. When one of them said, "The teacher should thank the dirt for catching her," the group broke into chuckles, and before she could stop herself, Annie's eyes filled with tears. She turned away quickly, clutching the torn ribbon from her lap, meaning to toss it into the fire just to stop remembering. But before she could, a shadow crossed the light. Toka stood there, silent, his face unreadable. "Don't burn it," he said quietly. She froze, the ribbon trembling between her fingers. "It's useless now." "Nothing that remembers kindness is useless," he said. Then he crouched beside her, the fire painting his skin in copper light. "You still hurt?" She shook her head. "I've been hurt before." "This kind?" he asked, and she didn't answer because no one had ever asked it that way. He took the ribbon from her gently, the roughness of his hand somehow steadying. From a small leather pouch at his waist, he drew a thin cord of his own braid, dark and strong, and tied the broken ribbon to it, knot by knot, until it looked whole again. "Now it is stronger," he said, handing it back. "Because it broke." Her breath caught. "You fix things that don't belong to you?" "Only when they shouldn't have been broken," he replied, and stood before she could find words. She watched him walk back toward the horses, the light catching the feather in his braid once more. Around her, the laughter had stopped, though she hadn't noticed when. For the first time since the fire that took her school, she didn't feel like ashes. She felt like something still burning quietly. When she looked down at the ribbon, it no longer felt torn. It felt like proof that even broken things could be carried with honor. By dawn, the wagons were rolling again, creaking through a narrow trail where tall grass whispered secrets against the wheels. The land had turned wild and strange. No fences, no markers, just endless horizon and wind. Annie Doyle walked near the back this time, her patched skirt brushing against dry sage, the mended ribbon tied carefully around her wrist. She kept her head low, avoiding the eyes that still found her whenever she stumbled, but she noticed something new. Their laughter no longer carried. It hung there, cautious, like people unsure whether to risk it. Ahead, Toka Gray Elk rode beside the scout leader, pointing out broken ground and hidden gullies where the wagons could tip. He said little, only gesturing, his calm presence keeping the horses from spooking at shadows. Annie had begun to watch how the others moved around him, the way some gave him space as if his silence made them uneasy, while others followed his lead without realizing. When the wind shifted that morning, she caught the faint scent of smoke on it. "Is there a town ahead?" she asked the woman walking beside her. "Not for 50 miles, came the answer, and something cold crawled up her spine. Minutes later, Toka turned in his saddle, his eyes narrowing toward the north ridge. "Fire," he said simply. The word spread down the line like a crack of thunder. "Brush fire?" one man asked. "No," Toka said, scanning the wind. "Campfire, wrong side of the wind. Travelers, maybe." The wagon leader frowned. "Bandits?" "Or hungry men," Toka replied. "Both are dangerous." The group hesitated, arguing over whether to stop or keep moving, but the prairie decided for them. A shout came from the front as a horse reared, and before anyone could react, 2 riders appeared over the rise, rifles glinting. Panic spread fast. People dove for cover. The wagons shuddered to a halt. Annie crouched behind a wheel, heart pounding so loud she could barely hear. The riders weren't bandits, not exactly. They were drifters, men with hollow eyes and hands that shook when they aimed their guns. "Food," one of them barked, "or someone dies." The air hung still. Then, before the leader could answer, Toka stepped forward, slow and steady, his palms raised. "You want food," he said evenly. "We share." "No guns." The men laughed. "You talk like you got any say here, Red Man." Toka didn't flinch. "The gun shakes in your hand." Hunger makes bad aim. Something in his tone made the man hesitate, lowering the rifle just enough for the wagon leader to throw a sack of dried meat toward them. "Take it," the leader said, voice trembling. The drifter caught it, still glaring. "You're lucky," he muttered, then spat near Toka's boots before riding off with his partner. For a long time, no one moved. Then the driver nearest Annie spoke. "Guess the Indian's good for something after all." The words hung heavy, and Toka turned away without reply, mounting his horse again. Annie rose slowly, her knees shaking, and called after him, her voice soft but clear. "You didn't have to stand between them and us." He paused, glancing over his shoulder. "Yes," he said. "I did." Their eyes met across the trail, and for a moment the prairie seemed to breathe again. The others went back to loading the wagons, muttering under their breath. But Annie couldn't stop watching him ride ahead into the wind. Tall, silent, and unshaken, as if the land itself trusted him more than the people he'd just saved. That evening the wagon stopped by a narrow creek that wound through a field of white ash trees, their trunks pale as bone against the deepening dusk. The air smelled of damp earth and smoke, and though the others built fires and cooked in groups, Annie Doyle found herself walking toward the far bank, drawn by the quiet sound of water over stone. She saw Toka Gray Elk kneeling there, washing blood from his forearm where a fresh cut ran deep. The drifters hadn't hit him during the standoff, but when one rifle misfired, a splinter of lead had grazed his arm. He hadn't mentioned it to anyone. She hesitated at first, afraid he'd turn her away. But when the water turned red and he winced slightly, she stepped closer. "You're hurt," she said softly. He didn't look up. "It is small." "Small things get worse if you ignore them," she replied, kneeling beside him before he could protest. From her satchel, she pulled a scrap of linen, one of the few she had left from her teaching days. "Hold still." He watched her hands as she dipped the cloth into the creek, wrung it out, and pressed it gently to the wound. He didn't flinch, but she could feel his muscles tense under her fingers. "You shouldn't have stood so close to those men," she said, her voice barely above the water's murmur. "You think courage means no fear?" "I think courage means you walk toward it anyway," he answered quietly. She smiled faintly. "You sound like a teacher." "You sound like someone who still believes words can stop pain," he said. "Sometimes they can," she whispered. He turned to look at her then. Really look. His amber eyes reflecting the firelight flickering from camp across the creek. "Your words didn't stop them from laughing," he said, not cruelly but truthfully. She looked away, her breath trembling. "No," she said, "but yours did." He didn't reply, but something in his gaze softened. "You've seen worse than laughter," he said finally. "Yes," she admitted. "A fire took everything. My school, my husband, even the children I taught. I ran until there was nothing left to carry but guilt." He nodded slowly, rinsing his hand. "Fire takes what it wants. It took my sister." The words fell like stones into the creek, and for a moment neither of them breathed. "How old was she?" Annie asked gently. 12, he said. "White soldiers burned our camp in winter. I was away hunting. When I came back, there was only snow." Her throat tightened. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," he said. "I stopped being angry at the snow." It only fell where it was told. She finished wrapping the cloth around his arm, tying it with the same ribbon she'd worn at her wrist. "Now we're even," she said softly. "You carried me. I bind you." He looked down at the ribbon, then back at her, and for the first time, he smiled. Not with joy, but with something deeper, like a scar remembering warmth. "You gave your color to my wound," he said. "That means it will heal." She wanted to answer, but the words tangled in her throat. The night breeze rippled through the ash trees, and the world felt almost still. They sat there side by side until the fire burned low, the sound of water washing over silence that no longer felt empty. The next day dawned with a restlessness that carried through the camp like a scent of rain before the storm. Clouds bruised the sky, dark and low, pressing shadows across the prairie as the wagons began to roll again. Annie Doyle walked near the center this time, her steps steady despite the ache in her ankle, the ribbon she'd tied around Toka Gray Elk's arm visible as a faint line of color beneath his sleeve. It felt strange, almost sacred to see something of hers carried by him. It made her heart tighten in a way she didn't know how to name. The others noticed, too. Murmurs followed them down the trail, whispers of the schoolmarm and her Indian, spoken with smirks that pretended to be jokes. By noon, those whispers turned into tension. The air thickened, the wind shifting westward, the horses uneasy. One of the wagon men, Burke, a broad, hard-faced farmer with too much drink in his breath, rode back along the line, stopping where Annie walked. "Heard you've been keeping company with the scout," he said, his grin cruel. "Careful, miss. Folks might think you prefer his kind." The words stung like a slap, but before she could answer, Toka turned his horse sharply, the movement smooth but commanding. "You have a problem?" he asked, his voice low. Burke laughed. "No problem. Just warning her she don't belong where she ain't wanted." Toka's gaze didn't waver. "And where is that?" "Anywhere near decent folk," Burke spat. The air went still, every sound swallowed by the wind. Annie stepped between them, her pulse racing. "That's enough," she said firmly. "You should go." Burke's eyes gleamed with malice. "You defending him now? You'd trade your place among us for his?" She held his stare, the trembling in her hands hidden by sheer will. "If decency means standing by while you humiliate someone better than you'll ever be, then yes. I'd trade it gladly." A ripple went through the group, half shock, half admiration, but Burke's pride couldn't bear the sting. "Careful, teacher," he sneered. "A man like him don't save women like you." He collects them. Before he could say another word, Toka dismounted in one slow, deliberate motion, the ground seeming to tilt under his weight. He didn't reach for a weapon. He just stepped forward, eyes fixed on Burke, every inch of him calm but dangerous. "You talk too much," he said. Burke's hand twitched toward his belt, but Toka stopped him with a single look, a stillness so absolute it silenced even the wind. "You draw," Toka said quietly. "You die in shame. You walk away. You live." The moment stretched thin as glass. Then Burke muttered something under his breath, spat in the dirt, and rode off toward the front wagons. For a long time, no one spoke. Then a woman near the fire wagon whispered, "He didn't even touch him." "Didn't need to," another murmured. Annie turned to Toka, her voice trembling. "You could have killed him." He shook his head. "If I kill for every word, I become the echo of the man who first threw it. Her throat tightened. You saved me again. No, he said. This time, you saved me. They walked on in silence, the storm finally breaking overhead, rain pouring down in silver sheets that washed the dust from the trail. The others hurried to cover their wagons, but Annie didn't move. She looked at the sky, letting the water soak through her hair and skirt, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel dirty from being seen. She felt clean for standing tall. The storm didn't stop when night came. It deepened, turning the camp into a blur of rain and shivering lanterns. The wagons huddled close like frightened cattle. Annie Doyle sat inside a small supply tent, her wet hair clinging to her cheeks, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The sound of thunder rolled through the hills, slow and heavy, and every few minutes, lightning flashed against the wagon wheels, throwing quick white ghosts of light across the prairie. She hadn't seen Toka Gray Elk since the confrontation that afternoon. He'd disappeared into the downpour, likely tending to the horses or scouting the ridge for flash floods. But she couldn't stop thinking about the way he'd stood between her and Burke, unarmed, unflinching, his calm more powerful than rage. She kept replaying the moment he said, "You saved me," trying to understand how mercy could sound stronger than victory. When the rain slowed to a whisper, she stepped outside, pulling her shawl tight around her shoulders. The air smelled of pine and lightning. In the distance, she saw a faint glow, a single lantern moving along the ridge. Something told her it was him. Without thinking, she followed. Her boots sank into mud, the hem of her skirt soaked and heavy, but she kept walking until she reached the narrow outcrop overlooking the dark valley below. Toka stood there, the lantern hanging from one hand, his figure outlined by the last flash of lightning behind him. He turned when he heard her. "You should be by the fire," he said quietly. "The storm's not gone." "Neither are you," she answered, breathless. He looked away, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. "I was making sure the trail holds. The ground's weak after rain." "You check the world even when it tries to break you," she said. He said nothing, but his silence carried warmth. For a moment they stood there, the wind lifting strands of her hair, the lantern between them flickering like a heartbeat. "They won't forgive me for standing up to him," she said softly. "They'll forget," he replied. "People forget what they don't understand." "Do you?" she asked. "Forget?" "No," he said, "but I remember quieter." She smiled faintly, her eyes on the valley. "I never thanked you for what you did." "You already did," he said, "when you didn't hide." The words made her throat tighten, but before she could speak, a sharp gust of wind nearly blew out the lantern. She caught it just in time, her hand brushing his. The touch froze them both. His skin was cold, her fingers trembling against his, and in that stillness, something wordless passed between them. A promise neither of them meant to make, but both understood. He let go first, taking the lantern and placing it on the ground between them. "The rain will start again soon," he said. "Then let it," she whispered. He met her eyes, and for a heartbeat, the whole world seemed to shrink to that flickering circle of light. The man who lived in silence, and the woman who had forgotten how to be seen. When thunder rolled again, it sounded softer, like the sky was exhaling. They walked back to camp side by side, saying nothing, but their shadows stretched long and close behind them, bound together by the glow of a single flame that refused to go out. Morning came heavy and gray, the air thick with smoke instead of mist. A low hum spread through camp, that uneasy murmur that always meant something had gone wrong. Annie Doyle woke to the smell of burning canvas and the sound of shouts. Her heart leaping before her feet even touched the ground. She ran toward the noise, skirts clinging to her legs, and froze when she saw it. The rear wagon engulfed in flames, orange tongues licking at the wheels as two men tried in vain to throw water from buckets that hissed uselessly in the heat. A child screamed from inside, the sound slicing through the morning air like glass. Without thinking, Annie moved forward, but Toka Gray Elk was already there, pulling the wagon cover loose, smoke swirling around his shoulders. "Stay back!" someone shouted, but he didn't hear, or didn't care. The wooden frame cracked, sparks flying as he climbed onto the burning boards. Annie saw him reach inside, his arm disappearing into the smoke, then emerge again, clutching a little boy by the back of his shirt. He dropped the child into waiting arms below before the flames roared higher, trapping him in. The crowd gasped as the side of the wagon collapsed, but in that same instant, Toka leapt clear, rolling into the dirt just as the wagon burst in a thunderclap of sparks. He lay there for a moment, coughing, soot streaking his face. Annie ran to him, kneeling beside him as he tried to push himself up. "You're burned," she said, her voice shaking. His sleeve was charred, skin blistered beneath it. "I'm fine," he rasped, trying to stand. "No, you're not," she said, catching his arm. He looked at her then, eyes raw and bright. "The boy lives," he said simply. "That's enough." Around them the others stood frozen, awed, guilty, wordless. Even Burke, who had once spat at his feet, looked away, shame carved into his face. The wagon leader cleared his throat. "We'll camp here until noon. Let the smoke pass," but no one moved until Annie took Toka's arm and led him towards the creek. They sat in silence as she poured water over the burns, her hands trembling as she worked. "You could have died," she whispered. "Many times," he said softly. "That one would have meant something." Her eyes filled with tears. "Don't say that." "It's true," he replied. "You saw them. They'd have let that child burn because he wasn't theirs." "I couldn't." "Then whose was he?" she asked. Toka looked out at the river, its surface still reflecting the smoke. "All children belong to someone who remembers pain." The words silenced her, the weight of them sinking deep. She wrapped his arm again with what linen she had left, the same fabric she'd used once before. "You keep saving people who don't deserve it," she said. "That's what mercy looks like," he murmured. The light changed then, the storm clouds thinning, the sun cutting through the haze until gold touched the water. Annie watched him stare at it, his face still blackened with ash but peaceful, almost holy. Behind them, the settlers began rebuilding, quieter this time, their eyes following him not with suspicion, but with something closer to reverence. When he finally stood, his shadow fell long across the creek, and she rose beside him, still holding the ribbon that had somehow survived both fire and rain. "The world keeps breaking you," she said softly, "and you keep fixing it." He looked at her, a faint smile ghosting across his lips. "Then maybe it's not broken," he said. "Maybe it's just still learning." By the time the caravan broke camp, the burned wagon lay behind them like a grave. The boy Toka saved rode in the front wagon now, sleeping against his mother's chest, while whispers of the rescue followed the wind. No one laughed anymore. No one dared. Yet Annie Doyle could feel a different kind of tension tightening around the group. Shame mixed with unease, like they didn't know whether to thank the man they'd once feared or pretend nothing had happened at all. Toka Gray Elk rode at the rear, as always, his arms still wrapped, the burn hidden beneath her careful stitching. She watched him from time to time, wanting to speak but sensing he didn't need words. When the trail curved north along the ridge, a rider appeared from the horizon. A courier from the fort, carrying mail and government papers. The wagon leader waved him down, eager for news. The man dismounted, handed over a small sack of letters, and pointed toward Toka. "One for your scout," he said. "Official." The others glanced uneasily as the leader passed it over. The envelope bore a red seal. Military. Toka studied it for a moment, then turned his horse towards the quiet edge of the ridge and opened it alone. Annie followed at a distance, sensing trouble in the way his shoulders stiffened as he read. When he finally lowered the paper, his hand trembled. She stepped closer. "Bad news?" she asked softly. He didn't answer right away, only crushed the letter in his palm until the paper tore. "They want me to return east," he said at last. "To testify." "Testify?" she echoed. "Against who?" "A soldier," he said. "One who burned my village, the one who—" He stopped, jaw tightening. "Who killed my sister." The words struck her like a blade. That was years ago. They say they finally found him. "They want me to name him." She saw something flicker in his eyes then, not anger, but something heavier, older, like a wound opening under light. "Will you go?" she asked. "If I go," he said, "I leave you. The trail. Everything I've built to forget. And if you stay?" "He walks free," he said quietly. The wind rose then, catching the torn paper and carrying it over the ridge where it vanished into the sky. "Maybe this is the mountain's way," he murmured. "It never lets me keep peace for long." She stepped closer, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "You told me once mercy makes small men shrink. Maybe this time mercy means standing up, not walking away." "Mercy for him?" he asked bitterly. "No," she said. "For yourself." For her, he turned sharply, meeting her gaze. "You sound like her," he said. "Like my sister when she told me to stop fighting the world." "Maybe she sent me to remind you," Annie whispered. The silence between them thickened, filled with the hum of insects and far-off thunder. "If I go," he said finally, "I may not come back." "Then I'll wait," she answered, her voice breaking. "You've taught me how." For a moment he just looked at her, the woman who'd once fallen into dust and risen with dignity he didn't know still existed. Then he reached up, untying the feather from his braid, and placed it gently in her hand. "If the mountain takes me again," he said, "this will tell you I found my way home." She tried to speak, but couldn't. He mounted his horse and rode down the trail, his figure shrinking against the red dusk. Annie stood at the ridge long after he disappeared, clutching the feather, the wind lifting her hair like a quiet prayer sent after him. The fort sat on a scar of red earth 2 days east, its wooden walls darkened by rain and memory. The wind never stopped there. It whistled through every crack as if trying to escape the things men had done inside. Toka Gray Elk rode alone toward its gate, his body still aching from the burns that hadn't fully healed. The feather gone from his hair, but its absence heavy as stone. He hadn't slept since leaving the caravan, haunted by dreams of smoke, his sister's voice calling through the trees, and Annie Doyle's trembling whisper. "Maybe she sent me to remind you." The guard recognized him and led him to the commander's quarters without a word. Inside, 3 officers waited around a table stacked with reports and ink-stained maps. "You are Gray Elk?" one asked. He nodded. "You understand why you're here?" "To speak," he said. The officer handed him a photograph, faded, grainy, showing a group of soldiers outside a burned lodge. "We believe this man led the raid against your people," the officer said, pointing to one in the center. "Colonel Miles Haddon. He's alive, awaiting trial in the barracks. We need your account to confirm his guilt." Toka looked at the image for a long time, his heart pounding like distant drums. He remembered that face, young then, laughing as the flames took everything. "You sure you want truth?" Toka asked. Truth doesn't change what's buried. It changes what grows above it, the officer said quietly. They led him outside to the holding tent, where a gray-haired man sat shackled to a post, staring at nothing. His uniform hung loose, his eyes sunken. For a moment, Toka didn't see a murderer. He saw a relic of cruelty already dying. Haddon looked up, blinking. "You!" he rasped. "I thought you'd have killed me by now." Toka stepped closer, the dirt crunching beneath his boots. "I almost did," he said, "every day." The soldiers watched from a distance, unsure whether to intervene. "You remember what you did?" Toka asked. "I was following orders," Haddon said weakly. "It was war." "It was winter," Toka said. "And she was 12. The man's eyes flickered, shame fighting decay. "I remember the girl," he whispered. "She screamed." "Yes," Toka said. "She screamed your name." Silence swallowed them both. The younger soldiers shifted uneasily, but Toka didn't move. "You want me to speak for your law," he said, turning toward the officers. "But your law already let him live this long." "My words won't make him pay. They'll just help you sleep. Then why come?" one asked. Toka looked back at Haddon, his voice low and steady. "Because if I don't, I'll keep killing him in my head." He stepped forward, knelt, and pressed his palm against the dirt. "This ground remembers," he said softly. "It needs no witness." Then he stood, walked past them, and left the fort without signing a word. The officers called after him, but he didn't stop. Outside, the sky was breaking open with light after days of rain, the sun catching on the river like fire without smoke. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the torn corner of the letter he'd once thrown away. On it, a single phrase still legible: "You have done enough." He stared at it, then let it fall into the water. The current took it west, the same direction the caravan would be by now. He closed his eyes, hearing Annie's voice again. "Then I'll wait." And for the first time since his sister's death, he believed someone would. The prairie had begun to thaw when Toka Gray Elk finally reached the ridge again, the snow giving way to new grass, the world smelling faintly of rain and ash. Weeks had passed since the trial, and though the soldiers had begged him to stay, he left before sunrise, carrying nothing but the memory of words he never spoke, and the peace he didn't know he'd earned. The sun was setting behind him now, long gold shadows spilling over the plains, when he saw it, smoke rising from the old camp hollow near the creek. He slowed his horse, the rhythm of its hooves falling into the pulse of his heart. And there she was, standing by a small fire that glowed against the dusk, her shawl caught in the wind like a banner. Annie Doyle had been waiting. Her eyes found him before the sound of his horse reached her, and for a moment neither moved, as if afraid the air itself might shatter. Then she smiled. Small, uncertain, but real. And that was enough to bring him home. He dismounted, slower than before, the scars on his arm pale against the fading light. "You came back," she said softly, her voice breaking on the edge of disbelief. "The mountain let me," he answered. She stepped closer, the distance between them dissolving like mist. "Did you find peace?" she asked. "I found the truth," he said. "Peace will come when I stop asking why." She nodded, tears bright in her eyes. "And him?" "He'll die with his guilt," Toka said. "That's punishment enough." He looked at her then, the firelight flickering across her face. "You waited." "You told me to," she whispered, and then, after a pause that felt like prayer, "I wasn't waiting for forgiveness. I was waiting for you to believe you deserved it." The words hit him harder than any storm, and he had to look away to steady himself. "When I left, I didn't know if I'd come back," he said. "I didn't either," she replied, "but I built a small school by the creek anyway, something that could grow, whether you did or not." He smiled faintly, the first real smile she'd ever seen from him. "The mountain gives back more than it takes," he said quietly. "Sometimes," she said, "it gives back people." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of everything they hadn't said. He reached into his coat then, pulling out a single thing, the feather she'd given him back without knowing. He'd kept it, wrapped in cloth through every mile. "You left this with me," he said. "Now it belongs here." He tucked it into her hair, the white plume trembling in the wind. "Why here?" she asked. "Because this is where prayers rise," he said. The sun slid behind the ridge, turning the sky to fire, and the two of them stood there, framed by the light. The teacher who had learned to stand, and the warrior who had learned to kneel. In the distance, the trail shimmered under the dying sun, stretching west into a world still wide enough for mercy. Annie reached for his hand, their fingers fitting together like two threads that had traveled different looms, but finally found the same fabric. "So," she whispered, "what do we call this?" Toka looked at her, eyes soft as dusk. "Not an ending," he said. "Just something the mountain gave back." Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Echoes of the West. If you had fallen, and the world laughed, would you believe someone who lifted you without a word? Tell us in the comments below.